Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome to the Holland Land Office for the next edition of our Java with Joe series, sponsored by Tim Hortons. So thank you to them for providing all the sustenance this morning. We're very happy to have our Curator Tyler Angora here to talk about how the newest exhibit came to be and sort of information behind it. How we went from his brain to the front hall. So, Tyler, take it away.
So, some of you here have already seen this presentation a couple weeks ago. Luckily, we know we're adaptable. But things have changed because I wanted you guys to see different photos than what you saw last time for those of you who were previously here. But yeah, so this presentation, I'm going to really talk to you about kind of how this exhibit came to be. A lot of times, a lot of people ask us how we create our exhibits, especially our intern Daniel, who just came to us from Rockford this year for his last semester. He was really interested to see kind of how exhibits develop and kind of how they grow. Sometimes they come to us just due to what's going on, like the solar eclipse with 98 years since the sun went out. That was a pretty easy one. The wedding exhibit just came about because we had so many wedding dresses. But this one was special because it just grew out of nothing, basically. So this started back in November of 2023, a long time ago. I was only here for about 5 months, going through upstairs, just kind of going through things, finding things, and I came across a banker-sized box filled with fabric scraps and lace trims that the collections committee had put into the education collection, which if you don't know what that is, that's our collection that we take around with us that we don't really put out on display. We just bring it around to schools and programming, just in case anything happens. Those we don't care much about if something were to get spilled on it or anything, unlike our permanent collection. But when I opened it, my training is in textiles, so pulling all these pieces out, I'm like, oh wait, this is a dress sleeve, this is a skirt trim. And Ryan was upstairs and I was like, wait, this is an exhibit. And there was just a puzzled look on his face, which I'm sure you can imagine how we're going to turn this little box into an exhibit, which I didn't think it would be as big as it is, but it is. And it was originally called A Dressmaker's Tale, not Work, because the original thought was to just make a story up about a 19th century dressmaker. I didn't actually think in a rural county like Genesee County there'd be as many dressmakers as there were to tell a story about. But I'm sure you can guess with over a year of research, that changed. But I really had to start this process. Granted, I had this box of things, but even though I'm trained in textiles and costumes, I only really know about the costumes, not about the person that made them. So I really had to take a deep dive into what a dressmaker was. Because we always hear about tailors and seamstresses, and we kind of intertwine all their language and definitions, but they're actually very distinctly different. Definitely a tradesperson that's making these very bespoke garments for the aristocrats around, because these garments are very expensive, they are not cheap. So it is definitely something that the wealthy were doing. And as you can see here, Miss Emma Partridge, 13 Ellicott Street, right around the corner. Lots of these were in the Daily News. She was actually not from around here. She was here visiting her sister. She was kind of harboring in her sister's house, and she used her bedroom to open up a dressmaker shop. Because why not, if you can make some money while you're here? But what sets these women apart from seamstresses and tailors? So they are very different in the sense of their craft. So tailors and seamstresses usually create something out of something that's usually already produced. They can either modify it or tailor it to that person. They're not usually creating something from the ground up. Unless they're using a pattern, which came into effect in the mid-19th century. Patterns were not used in the dressmaking world. If you were using a pattern as a dressmaker, you were more than likely not getting business, just due to what I had found in research. But what set these women apart were these 3 things, which you would think a tailor and a seamstress would know, but these women were highly skilled in these 3 that really set them apart. So the biggest one is the pin to form technique. So they're not using anything but the customer's body to create this garment. That's why it's called a bespoke costume. So they're draping and pinning fabric to the customer in their undergarments, or they're just draping it over their clothing that already pre-exists. And this technique typically takes a few try-ons to get it correct. You have to constantly keep trying things on to make sure it fits properly. Whereas with the seamstress and a tailor, you measure once and you do it, and then you put it on, and then you just kind of fill in gaps where there are holes or something that doesn't fit right. This you have to constantly keep trying on and off and make sure that it fits perfectly. And scissor and cutting skills. So if you've walked through the exhibit already, and if you have not, feel free after. Those bodices, you can't just cut a straight line. There's a lot of curves and a lot of dips and a lot of different ways of cutting, and you have to be very precise in how you do that because this fabric is not cheap at the time. These fabrics typically range from like 75 cents to $5, which doesn't sound like a lot now. It's very expensive at this time, so you don't want to waste it. And the other part is sewing skills. A lot of these dressmakers use sewing machines, but for basic things like a waistband or the trim on a skirt at the bottom. Most of these dressmakers are using hand sewing techniques throughout this whole process. Most of the bodices that you see are all hand stitched, if not probably 75%. Again, they would only use a sewing machine for kind of like minuscule things they didn't want to waste their time on. So, very different. That's what really sets these women apart. And you can't just go into this trade. You can't just say, oh, hey, I'm a dressmaker, I'm an amateur, I learned by myself at home. You're not going to get customers that way. A lot of the dressmakers that were here in the county were about in their late 20s, early 30s, and that typically means that they had a long time as apprentices to learn these skills. Through research, I found that a lot of the dressmaker apprentices would either cut skirts out or cut bodices out for long periods of time to get it in like their muscles to really know what they were doing so that later they could open their own shop or just be a partner in their shop with their kind of leader. So, but I'm sure you're wondering why. Why dressmakers? Why this topic? We've been a museum for 130 years. A lot has been covered. So I really wanted to find something that we hadn't touched on. And this was one of them. And our clothing collection had not really been on display for a long time. Love Ryan, but clothing is not his forte. He'll even tell you that himself. So coming here and actually going through upstairs, we have a massive 19th century clothing collection, which is actually pretty impeccable, which obviously you see in the exhibit, but there's more upstairs that's hidden away. But these women have really been forgotten in history. Typically when you think of Genesee County, you think of Johnson Harvester, Mary Richmond, Dean Richmond, Rowell, spiritualists. You don't really think of these women that were making a living making all these clothing for those people. They were clothing Mary Richmond, Mrs. Rowell. So they were a big part. They really created kind of the material culture of Genesee County. And it wasn't just here in Batavia and Leroy, it was all around the county. If you go into the exhibit, the folder has names from everywhere, scattered throughout. But this is an example of a dress that's not from around here, because you're going to get to see those, so I wanted to show you some things that weren't from around here. So this is a dress from the Met from 1880 to 1805. The maker is unknown. So the maker is unknown because a lot of these dressmakers didn't put their names in their clothing. It just was a minuscule detail that costed them money, basically. It was not really worth their time to just put their name in it unless you were very wealthy as a dressmaker and very well known, like Frederick Worth put his name in almost every garment he made. These dressmakers were not doing that. Again, they had to make money. They were trying to do this very quickly. So if they could skip steps like that, they just would. But this is a very exquisite gown. It's from America, and it is definitely quite fabulous, in my opinion. But yeah. But who do we remember? So like I just said, we typically forget about these rural kind of dressmakers from our county, just like every other county in the world. But these are the folks that we do remember, which isn't a bad thing because these three people really put 19th century fashion on the map. So they're good in a sense, but they overshadow the people that were really dressing kind of the vast majority of the middle to upper class. For you to have a gown from these three, you had to have a lot of money. The dressmakers here were really doing the middle to upper class. These were just doing the upper class people. So we have Frederick Worth, who is probably the most well-known 19th century couturist. His gowns are in almost every large museum that there is, especially the Met. And then we have Emile Pignet. There is actually a dress from Emile at the Leroy House. It is a wedding gown that belonged to one of the Leroy girls that married into the family. It's an astonishing gown. It's very pretty. But he was more so known for his outerwear, his cloaks and coats. And what is very fascinating about him, unlike Frederick, he licensed his designs so that other shops could purchase them and make them. So kind of like a pattern, but not really. You would still go through the pin to form technique, but you would use his design and not create your own, which was very interesting for the time where Frederick did not do that. He didn't have to. He had a line of women outside his door wanting a dress made from Frederick Worth. And then this is my favorite one. So this is not the designer, this is the wearer. So this is Suzanne Morgan from Brockport, if you know the Morgan Manning house. Yes, the fire happened in January. Luckily this dress is saved. So Suzanne is pictured in her wedding dress in October of 1896, and she was wearing a gown from Jacques Doucet, who is a very well-known French couturist from the 19th century, and as you can tell, it is quite the gown. So when I was an intern in 2021, they did not know this dress existed. It was harbored in a chest in the attic, and we came across it. And on the inside tag it says Jacques Doucet, which for Brockport, the Morgans weren't what we thought to be that wealthy, but apparently Suzanne and the Morgans were, because this dress was very expensive. It's a humongous train. There's a lot of fabric, there's a lot of detail, and it's a very stunning gown, and it's made with Duchess satin silk, which is not cheap. It is one of the most luxurious fabrics you can ever buy. It is very heavy and very shiny and very pretty. So we have two huge couturists right down the road from us, which is crazy to think of. I wish they were here in this collection. But it's great that these two exist not just 30 minutes away from us. So it's great to know that we have people that were here wearing these types of gowns, and it wouldn't surprise me if Mary Richmond had one or two of them in her collection at some point. But these are the three that we really remember from this period. They really put this on the map, but again, they overshadowed the more local, rural women that were around this area doing this, which you can see right here. So how did I find these women for this exhibit? So in the exhibit, we have about over 300 names and addresses available for people to see. But I'm actually continuing this for my master's program, and I am above 400 at the moment.
Wow.
So between 1860 and 1900, there are over 400 women doing this trade thus far. I've only gotten to the 1880 census. There's a lot more to do. So you get to see that right here. So this is the 1880 federal census. And as you can see over here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 dressmakers just listed in the census records. So one of them is Cordelia Blair. She is 51 at this time. So she is buried in Elmwood. Ryan was traumatized in October. I found her in the 1881 directory for Genesee County. She's on Find a Grave, but you can't read her grave. So we went grave hunting for about 40 minutes before the ghost walk, but I parked 2 graves away. So poor Ryan had to truck through the cemetery for just a 5-step away grave, which is fine. But yeah, so this is how I found all of them, through the city and county directories. Though they were probably the most prominent resource because they list their address and their name, but you had to pay to be in them. So obviously not every dressmaker can either afford or wants to pay for that advertisement. But they were kind of the ones that led me in the direction of all of this. So looking through our directories, the one at the county historian and at the Richmond, I was able to find the majority of these women and their addresses, which if you go into the exhibit, there's a map of Batavia from 1904 and the 1904 Atlas of the county. So you can find your dressmaker and kind of go where you want in the county. I use the 1904 map and atlas because it's the most developed out of the counties, and it shows still the original street names and all of that, so it is comprehensive to this. But with the city and county directories, I then went to the census records. There are some things that I found after the exhibit up that I wish I found prior. So the census records are great in one sense, like this. There's 5 dressmakers in a row. But these are all not married women. If you were married and you're in the census record and you're a dressmaker that's in the directory, you're labeled as keeping home in the census if you're married. So if you're married and you have an occupation, it's more than guaranteed in the census record, you're going to be labeled as keeping home. Welcome to fragile masculinity of the 19th century. Because after the Revolutionary War, which 1776, we're going back further than where we are in this presentation, it was a struggle for men to make a living and support their family. So women did have to work, like today. But it wasn't thought highly of a man having their wife work to support their family. So it was very under wraps. You did not really talk about it. You did not speak. You did not advertise your wife doing work. And that transcends into this period. So in the federal census records, if you were married, you weren't given an occupation. You were just labeled as keeping home, or you were left without an occupation listed. Another kind of example of this, which isn't on here, is Susan Vaughn. She was a dressmaker in Leroy for the 1870s into the 1880s. She's listed in the directories as a dressmaker. She's listed in the 1870s census as keeping home, and then in the 1875 and 1880 census, she's blank. But for that whole decade, I know she's a dressmaker based on the directory. So, welcome to coverture laws, folks. And then the other one was Find a Grave. So, granted, I have these women in these places, but I don't know when they're born. I don't know if they're married. I don't know when they died. So, Find a Grave was great. Sorry, Ryan, for making the truck use cemetery. It was great to know more information of kind of their age, but a lot of these women have kind of fallen off the face of the earth. Most of them are not on Find a Grave due to either them not being cataloged yet, being married and moving out of the state. There's endless possibilities as to why they're not there yet, or if they'll ever be there. They could be buried in an abandoned cemetery that we just don't know about. But this was great because it got to kind of show me if they really stayed in our county or if they left. So a majority of them stayed, which yay for us. So that's lovely. And then our costume collection. So sadly, like I mentioned before on this slide, that a lot of these women didn't mark their clothing with their name or any details. So that was not the greatest resource. You know, me going into this project hoping to find a dress with a label from Batavia, from Genesee County. Yeah, that didn't happen. Except for one, which was due all on accident. So if you go into the exhibit in the back wall in the left side in that case with the Papa Smurf blue wedding gown, that is Elizabeth Wakeman's wedding gown, and she is listed in the 1893-1894 directory as a dressmaker. So, knowing her name in that coincidence, obviously it belonged to her, but we didn't know that it was made by her until I sent photos to Brandon Brooks at the Genesee Country Village Museum and looking it over with him and talking about it. In theory, just due to the fact that it looks so unfinished on the inside, which I gave you an opportunity to look up into the bodice, there's rough edges, there's loose threads, there's open seams. It's not as polished as a dressmaker's dress would be for a paying customer. So, with that information and those observations, we were able to kind of create a theory that she either made it herself or she had help making it. So either way, she had a hand in making this gown, because it's not very polished like a dressmaker's gown would be, which you have an example in the case with the 1855 to 1863 bodice, which if you look inside, it's very polished. There's no open seams, there's no loose threads. It's a very polished gown. Hers is not. So that is the only piece that we know exists in this county that belonged to one of these women. Both her own belongings and one that was created by one of the dressmakers, which is fantastic, which is why it's in the case so none of you could touch it. So, lovely. And then the other big one was the newspaper, which there's some newspapers in the exhibit, but there's plenty more that I didn't give you all. A lot of the dressmakers would advertise their work just like Emma Partridge did. And some of the millinery shops had dressmakers in their shops, because why not get a hat and a dress that match and they coincide with one another. So, like S&M Farrell, Susan and Mary Farrell, they were sisters. They owned a millinery and dress shop right on Main Street. It was 78 Main. They were on the top floor, and then they moved to the bottom level as time went on. They were there for 2 decades, which is a long time for these women. So, they would often have advertisements looking for a dressmaker, looking for a milliner. So the Daily News was a great resource to look at that and kind of see the progression of time for a lot of these women. And another great one was Mary Keiss. She was a dressmaker here, and she'd often travel to New York City to look at the latest fashions, which I can't know that with looking at the census and directories. So that was another great way to kind of see what fashions were really coming to Batavia and Genesee County. So clearly we weren't just making our own fashion rules here, we were following what was going on elsewhere, which is not uncommon. But with knowing all of this, I also had to figure out kind of the process of creating a gown of this stature. So with the process of making a garment, obviously you have to pick your dressmaker. You obviously don't want to go to the same dressmaker as your husband's sister or your sister. You want to have a different gown that's better than everybody else's. So this is kind of the four-way of the exhibit. You kind of walk through this process in the exhibit. So you pick your dressmaker, you kind of learn what they're about, where they are, what's closest to you, what's farther away. And then you have to find what you want made. Which then comes into my favorite part of the whole exhibit, fashion plates. So this was fun to learn about. I didn't know a lot about them, but not about their origins. So they originate in the 17th century, but they don't really become very prominent until the 18th century in 1759 when they're first published in the Ladies Magazine, which was a periodical. But they were quite expensive. They were etched on copper plates, which is not cheap, and it was a timely process. But this is how you would bring your design to a dressmaker. So whether you got the Ladies Magazine, the Delinator, Gotti's Ladies Books, Harper's Bazaar, they'd often have fashion plates showcasing the latest fashions from London, Paris, or New York. So this was one of the largest ways for women to bring an idea to their dressmaker saying, I want this sort of style, but not this fabric. What can we do? So once you've done that, then you go into picking your fabrics and trims. So like, I don't want this gown in these off-putting colors. I want a gown with blue and gray. So you're gonna go through and look at what you can get. And same thing with trims. I want lace trim instead of ribbon. I want tatted lace instead of princess lace. That's the process. And then she makes your gown and you get your finished product, which is the back side of the exhibit. You walk into decades of dresses showcasing different styles and occasions. And then you kind of go into refashioning of the gown either for wearing it or for memory. This was something that I did not know much of when I started this project. But it was great to learn because this lovely object fell into my lap, basically. So this is Ida Jackson's dress diary from the Brooklyn Archives. She lived in Brooklyn her whole life. So a dress diary was a way for women to memorialize their gowns. Obviously, you're paying a great deal of money for these gowns. You're probably only buying one or two a year because they're so expensive. So you want to capture that moment, and you're usually not just buying them for a random thing, you're buying them for a specific reason. Like you have a ball to go to, or you need a brand new walking dress because yours is so tatted, so you need a new one. This was a way for them to kind of memorialize either their last gowns or their new gowns. So hers is only one of a few that exists in the world. There's only 2 in the United States and there's 2 in Europe. Elsewhere, haven't been able to find one. But this was a way for them to really put that clothing on the map. And these are great because they really showcase so many different fabrics from the time and different things that they were wearing. But as you can see, kind of, there's dates and little notes with every single one, which we kind of have a deconstructed one in the exhibit. A lot of times women save pieces from their garments, whether they be from the dressmaker themselves, from the fabric they bought, or they would take a piece out. So that was another way to do that. And another way was for them to refashion gowns. So there's 2 examples of this in the exhibit. Actually, there's 3. The pink gown from the Morgan Manning house in the bottom of the case that has no sleeves and there's other pieces missing from it. We have some dress sleeves also. So a lot of times women would take apart bodices to put new parts on to keep up with the times because you don't want to keep rebuying dresses like we do today. You just couldn't afford it. Some people think our clothing today is expensive. It's very cheap in comparison to what it was. So if you're buying a $50 pair of jeans, just think back to this period. Your jeans probably would have cost you like $500 just from JCPenney. That's a lot of money. So refashioning was a huge portion of this. A lot of gowns that you more than likely see are probably not in their original state. They were probably altered at some point to change with the years, because every year something is different. nothing was the same back then, just like it isn't now. But these women wanted to keep up with the status quo, so they had to keep changing things, keep up with it. But the other good part about this exhibit was that I got to work with so many different historians throughout the county, and not just in our county either. Just like Genesee Country Village Museum, I got to work with my old supervisor, Brandon. He lent me the 1860s gown that you see in the exhibit, which was great because we didn't have an 1860s gown that was readily stable enough to be up for this long period of time in the way that I wanted to display it. So having worked in the collection, I just emailed him, hey, I know you have this 1860s gown, can I borrow it? Luckily, he obliged, so it's here. And same thing with the Morgan Manning House. I got to work with my first ever museum to bring out 2 pieces that I knew were remnant of refashioning gowns to keep up with the times. So they lent me that lovely piece that's in the back case on the right side, which is very stunning because we didn't have a true evening gown for the exhibit. And I knew they had this bodice and just the bottom skirt trim, so I was like, okay, that will fit. It doesn't showcase a full evening gown, but it gives you kind of an idea of the difference in between such a high neck and then a low neck for later at night. And then the Leroy Historical Society, so there's a few pieces from Leroy in the exhibit. So Leroy was another big hotbed of dressmakers at the time, just due to the development of Leroy, but also to another big thing that Leroy had during the time. Hingham University. If you don't know what it is, I'm going to tell you right now. It was the first women's college in New York, and it was the first chartered women's university in America. Over 8,000 students came through Ingham's doors. And obviously they're not lower class, working class girls going to this school. They're middle to upper class ladies, which you can see through the photos that exist from Ingham. They're in very custom gowns, so obviously let's go to Leroy to make these girls some gowns. So worked out. But working with them was great because I got to work with other historical societies in the county also, not just for pieces for the exhibit, but just for information. They gave me some information on some dressmakers that I couldn't find anything on. Same thing with Bethany, Virgin, Byron. I think I also worked with Alabama. I worked with so many I don't remember. But it was great to really expand our knowledge and kind of collaborate with so many different historical societies for the exhibit. And not only collaborate, but give them a platform also. So that's how the exhibit grew to the monstrosity that it is today. Any questions? Come on, all of you had a lot more questions, but I only had 4 slides.
Back in the beginning, you talked about the price, and I think you said 75 cents. Was that like a yard or for all the fabric?
It was just a yard.
For 1 yard?
That's a lot. But yeah, and there's not a comprehensive price on a gown that anyone can find. The book that I used to really create the foundation of this, Female Economy, Dressmakers and Milliners by Wendy Gamber, which was published in 1996. I actually just spoke with her 2 weeks ago for my graduate project. She said when she did her, she could not find a receipt, any indication of a price. And I mentioned this at the other talk, and I mentioned it to her. It kind of reminds you of the episode from I Love Lucy when she's going through her books and ledgers, creating her thing for Ricky to look through, and there's this slot called miscellaneous, 1,500 something. That's probably what a lot of it happened as, because obviously the woman isn't paying for this, their husband is, and I'm sure they didn't want them to know how much they were spending on a gown. So it wouldn't surprise us if that's what kind of happened. So, because sometimes you would see a milliner price, like a hat, like even a hat was $20. That's a lot back then. But there isn't really a distinct price for anything, so it's hard to really determine that.
Okay, so if it was 75 cents a yard, what was the actual width on it? Because today typically 42 to 44, but the dresses are so voluminous that it had to have been wider than that. No?
Usually it was typically, from what I have seen, 24 to 40, depending on the type of fabric.
That's Suzanne Morgan wedding dress by Genesee, or is that is that something that still exists?
Yeah, so it exists, just not in its original entirety. So the reason they didn't know it was her gown is because the sleeves are taken off the bodice is not attached, and they refashioned the bodice. So it's thought that she re-wore the gown at some point, because obviously this was not cheap. Just looking at it, even if it was made from a local dressmaker, it wouldn't be cheap, but with his name attached to it, that probably adds a few extra $100 to it. So, but looking at her original wedding photo and looking at all the different pieces that all matched with the label in the skirt, you can tell that it's all part of that skirt. And then when you look at her dress and look at the elements, like the pointed sleeve, the big mutton leg sleeves, the little trim that you guys can't see, but if you look at the photo up close, you can see the exact trim that's on that skirt. So using indicators like that, you can pinpoint that that's Suzanne's gown. So it still exists, just not in that complete form. So,
Do you know where it is?
yeah, it's at the Morgan House. Well, was at the Morgan House. It's at a storage facility because the house is in disarray. So, due to the fire.
Exactly how many dresses were made?
What?
Exactly how many dresses were made?
Were made?
Yes.
Oh. In what way? Like for a woman each year?
Yes.
Or a lady each year would like today you have a closet full of clothing. These women probably had 10 gowns, if that. And they would typically only get like 1 or 2 made a year for special occasions. Like this was probably Suzanne's budget for the whole year and she used it on her wedding gown. Which, good for you. I don't think I would have done that, but she refashioned it at some point. So it worked out. So you kind of, like you had your general walking dress that you would wear out to the markets, to stores, out walking, your house dress kind of every day, and then you'd have like a fancy gown for balls or church, kind of that thing. So you had very specific things.
So what you're saying is every piece of clothing, because I'm thinking, okay, you have a ball gown, you have a wedding gown. Of course, maybe you're not dusting because your housekeeper is, but you had to have some less than gowns just to get through.
Oh, yeah.
So those were seamstress type things?
Yeah, so a lot of times your house dresses, or what they were called as wrappers, because they were one piece, kind of like the dressing gown that's in the exhibit, you could buy those from a catalog, because you didn't need that to fit properly. You wore that at home. But when you're walking out, you want it to look pristine and fitted when you're walking out into society. But at home, you can typically just buy something from a catalog, like the Sears catalog. Lord & Taylor was around at this point. You could buy from their catalog. Or you would have your seamstress make something that just didn't need to fit properly.
Does she have a veil with that dress?
Yeah, she did. It's not pictured in the...
Because there's a lot of stuff going on in the back.
Yeah, she has a big cape.
Oh.
She has a cape with a bunch of tulle and some fur on it, which is pictured right there, but you guys can't really see it. But her veil is not pictured in the photos. But it is in the newspaper article that she had a very cathedral-like veil dress.
What did they wear to sleep in at nighttime?
Just a cotton nightgown. It was a very typically plain cotton dress that went typically all the way to the floor. Again, something your seamstress or you could have bought at a dry goods store that didn't need to fit properly. Unless you were on your wedding night, then you had a trousseau made. That was more spectacular than anything. And that was typically only worn once.
Tyler, as you were going through the collection upstairs, the fabrics, did you come across any that were just so deteriorated and you couldn't even handle them because they're 125 years old?
Oh yeah, there's a few. One of them was actually worn by Mary Peacock, who is related to the Evans by marriage somehow. I forget the family lineage. If you've ever looked at the Ellicott family tree, it's wild. We have her gown from about when she was 10. It's a yellow silk gown. You can't even touch it without fibers flying off of it. So it's packed away in a box far away from light and people in the public. It'll probably never be out on display unless we get it conserved, which would cost us a lot of money. But yeah, there's a few. But luckily, when I was working at Genesee Country, Darlene Braun, who is Brandon's assistant, has worked for Genesee Country for a long time as the curatorial assistant, so she's had a lot of training in repairing garments. And she trained me while I was there how to do it when she knew I was getting this job. So I've repaired some dresses, like one of them was in the wedding exhibit, the Kitty Parker Dennison wedding gown from 1889. That took about a month to make presentable. Just piecing things back together, fixing broken seams and all of that. So, lots of fun.
I'd like to know where you're taking your master's program.
SUNY Brockport. So,
What's the major called?
history. So, I'm just in a general history program. Experience gets you further than a degree. So, that's why I'm here.
It's very obvious you put a lot of time and effort into this display, and we appreciate all your time.
Thank you.
What was the business model for the dressmaker? Like, did she have 5 dresses being made at one time, or the rich person came in and you put everything else aside just to let her see her dress, or?
Typically what you were saying, like if, let's say Mary Richmond walked into the dressmaker shop, obviously you're gonna put your attention to Mary Richmond. Whoever had the deepest pockets got to go first, basically. Because these women, it's called a female economy. So it's an all-female transaction, but you're using your husband's money. And if your husband's not willing to pay for it, that dressmaker loses out on all of that stuff. Mary Richmond didn't have to worry about that. They knew they were gonna get their price tag. So obviously they're gonna drop what they're doing, help Mary Richmond go back to what they were doing previously. That's typically the business model. But it varies on where you are and who's obviously around. Like, other places around the county didn't have people like Mary Richmond, or like Mrs. Rowell, or Wired's wife that were walking in. They were more middle class, so it just depended on what was happening. But obviously if you're walking in and you're like, my wedding's in a week, I need a dress, you're like, I don't know if that's possible. Then you have to weigh your options.
How did they deal with like children's clothes? Because like they were custom making these gowns for women, but then with kids, like they grow so fast and they're probably reusing probably even dress fabric.
Oh yeah, there's lots of evidence of children's clothing being made and then either expanded, shrunk, reused. There's many examples at Genesee Country of this because they have a large child's clothing selection that's in their vault. And you get to really see that they've added panels to make it bigger, or they've altered things for different periods. So children's clothes, typically, they would use only cotton fabrics because it was cheaper. Unless it was like your christening gown or you had something special that you were doing with your child. There's not many child's clothing pieces that are made with satin or silk. It's mostly all cotton because it's cheaper.
They were made with sewing machines or hand sewn?
Typically
gowns?
with, are you talking about kids' dress?
No, the gowns.
Oh, the gowns,
Yes.
most of them are hand sewn. Majority of all the detailing and all of the bodice pieces are hand sewn.
How long did it take them to do that, you think?
Oh, depended on the gown. Like the black dress that's in the exhibit probably took a few weeks, if not a month. to finish, just due to all the detailing to it. Whereas the dress that's right behind it, the wool dress with the satin green ribbon, that could have taken just a week or two, because it's not as detailed or constructed as most.
Did they have people working under them? I mean, one person couldn't do it all themselves.
No,
But did they have trainees?
Yeah, they had apprenticeships, so you had apprentices help you that were doing like skirt cutting or skirt trim sewing, which is indicated in Wendy Gamber's book and in some other primary documents from some dressmakers that have left paperwork for us to see now. But apprenticeships were huge because obviously it was hard for one woman to just create a gown like that. That would have taken you a long time by yourself, so she probably had an apprenticeship. And a lot of times, a lot of sisters actually worked together. Like the Gloucester sisters were on School Street. There was 3 of them. They all were dressmakers. So it was sometimes a family affair. And a lot of times if your mom was a dressmaker, your daughter was a dressmaker. And if their mom was a dressmaker, their mom was a dressmaker. So it was kind of that way also. It was like a family business essentially. So, but the Gloucester sisters were really one of the examples of like a family working together. Because there's 3 of them and they're all in the same house on School Street working together, right in Batavia. Yeah.
I would think you would almost have to have 2 for a lot of these things because it's the draping and one person just, you can't pin into, it's not form, you got a body there.
Yeah, it's definitely an art form and you can definitely tell with a lot of the dresses in the exhibit and especially this one. Because this was not made in a couture house like Suzanne's was. Doucet, Worth, and Pignet all had a bunch of workers that were working on dresses at once. Their dresses did not take long to produce just because they had so many people working on them, just like Louis Vuitton does, Chanel and all of them. They all have a bunch of workers where a local dressmaker like that probably has 1 or 2 that are working with them.
For some of the bridal gowns really weren't white. I mean,
No.
some of those pictures that you see, they were different colors.
Yeah, just like Elizabeth Wakeman's gown is Smurf blue, it's bright blue. She really wore that because you couldn't afford back then to buy a white gown, just like even with Suzanne Morgan. She refashioned her gown because it was very expensive. So you wanted a gown you could re-wear instead of just buying a gown that you wore once like we do today and then put in a box from a dry cleaner and keep in your attic for 4 years hoping your daughter or granddaughter will wear it. So, unless you're my mom and turn your wedding gown into a Halloween costume. So, yeah.
Where and how did they get the fabric?
So a lot of times you could go through a wholesaler, like Lord and Taylor actually used to be a wholesaler of fabric. You used to be able to purchase trims, fabrics, and all of that fun stuff from Lord and Taylor. So lots of wholesalers, obviously not in Genesee County, even though you could go to a dry goods store and get some fabrics, or an ocean store, you could go to get some fabrics and some trims. But a lot of times you had to order from like Rochester or Buffalo or New York to get those kinds of fabrics, especially the ones that these women wanted because they don't want to just walk out in a cotton dress. They want to wear silk, satin, chiffon, crepe. They want to wear all these glorious fabrics that probably weren't readily available in Genesee County. So it was a luxury to do this.
Did the better fabrics come across the ocean, or were they available here in the States as well? Do you have bills for like silk and satin?
So a lot of silks and satins could have been made here, but a lot of them came from across the ocean. Because obviously if you could get silk from India, why wouldn't you? But a lot of the wholesalers purchased fabrics from overseas and then sold them through their company. So it's a long train of different things happening. It's like the domino effect. So, yeah.
Were the men's clothing at this time being made by tailors, or were they like catalog clothing?
Men's clothing probably probably like 1840 onward, you could have ordered in a catalog or by a tailor. Because again, a men's dress shirt doesn't really need to fit you that greatly. You just stuff it in your pants and make it fit, kind of. But a tailor would adjust whatever he needed to, but a lot of times you could have went to a dry goods store and bought a men's suit right off the rack. Men's clothing was a lot easier to mass produce because again, you don't have the female form. Mass production for women didn't really occur until the 1890s, late, and then into the turn of the century. And even then it was still like a shirtwaist that didn't need to form fit you. And it was just miscellaneous things like that. But men's clothing could be mass produced and then altered by a tailor to fit perfectly.
Do you have any hats in your collection?
Yes, we have many hats. A lot of hats. One day there will be a hat display. Diane will be the sponsor of that.
Agreed.
Any other questions? Yeah.
So I saw this video online and it was talking about these women called banner ladies, where they would sew things to their fancy dresses as like advertising. So like, did that exist? Because when I tried to like look it up, I couldn't find like real information. So I didn't know if it was like a fake thing I saw on the internet.
No, it's a real
It's
thing.
okay,
Oh,
cool.
yeah, no, it's real.
That's exciting because
Okay.
it was really cool.
Oh, yeah.
What was she asking about?
So a lot of times back in the 19th century, sometimes for balls and parties, women would sew on like advertisements, kind of like a Singer sewing machine banner on their dress. Like it was very odd, which is why there aren't really any photos, but it was an actual thing. And a lot of times it was done at like big balls or kind of like bizarre events where you had different women set up with different booths. If you've ever watched The Gilded Age on HBO, they have a bazaar at the hotel and there's different booths set up with different vendors, kind of. So,
Yeah, I actually have two questions.
yeah.
Did the dressmakers ever put their name in the clothes?
Yes, Jack Doucet put his name in it, and actually the brown dress from the Leroy House has a label in it from Susan Whiting in Buffalo, but I just didn't put that out because obviously it's not from Buffalo, not from Genesee County. It wasn't uncommon for them, but it was an added expense. If you wanted to do it, you had to pay extra. Sometimes you didn't want that added expense.
Like now, there's a particular place usually in clothing
Yeah.
where a label would be. Was there a spot where
Yeah,
a
it
label would
was
be?
typically, if you've ever looked inside of a bodice, which you can kind of see in this photo, these hanging straps to support the skirt, that would typically be where it is in the bodice or on the skirt waistband. Those were the two prominent places for a tag, but it was more so on the straps that really supported your bodice and your skirt.
No, I thought it was the tag printed or was it embroidered?
It was printed. And typically they were gold embossed printings. Like Jack's is printed on the skirt and it's all gold. Same thing with Sarah Whiting's and Susan Whiting in the exhibit. Hers is gold printed. Why it's gold, we have no idea. That just seems to be the color people wanted. Well, thank you all.
Thank you again, Tyler, for enlightening us all. Just a quick PSA, some upcoming events. We have our next night at the museum next Wednesday from 5 to 8. You can come after our normal hours and get a special tour, and Tyler may even take you upstairs to check out the collection. We've got our next trivia, which will be the 10th, which will be on the Baseball Hall of Fame, since opening day was today, so getting ready for that. We have a couple guest speakers in April, the 17th. Greg Kinnell's coming to talk about the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. And then the 24th at 7, we have Ben Kemp, who is from Grant's Cottage. I'll be talking about a soldier from the Adirondacks who fought on both sides of the Civil War. It'll be very interesting. And then our next Job with Joe will also be the 24th in the morning. Jill Louise Wilkes will be talking about the VA Center and the history of the Veterans Administration and how it ended up here in Batavia. So
Don't forget Tom Teresi.
I knew you were going to.
We have to.
And then Friday the 11th, we have Tom Teresi, who is a very acclaimed classical guitarist coming to play some very cool pieces. So that's also at 7. So hopefully you can come out to things. If you are a member, you're getting all this in an email today. If you're not, wink wink, maybe become one, and then you'll be notified every time something comes up. But we thank you for coming, and we'll see you again.
We have